Let me just read this headline to you. It's a headline from the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. It's the editorial, that's the official line or position of the newspaper. And it reads as follows. Israel, not Hamas, is derailing the Gaza ceasefire and preventing the hostages' return. Now, this article begins with the following paragraph. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu paid the asking price for Itamar Ben-Gvir's return to the government in advance. Not out of his own pocket, of course, but with the blood of the 59 hostages whose fate could be sealed by the resumption of the war, which has already sealed the fate of hundreds of Palestinians, including women and children. Now, Itamar Ben-Gvir, of course, is the far-right extremist national security minister in the governing coalition, although it's difficult to know how that label, far-right extremist, distinguishes him from other members of that governing coalition. What are we supposed to call Benjamin Netanyahu? A wanted man by the International Criminal Court with an arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. What do we call him? Centre-right? Clearly, this is a government of racist, genocidal extremists. Nonetheless, Ben-Gvir is even more committed, certainly openly committed, to the genocidal obliteration of the Palestinian people, not just in Gaza, but beyond. Now, as this editorial goes on to say, according to the statement released by Netanyahu's office, the decision to strike Gaza was made with Defense Minister Israel Katz after Hamas's repeated refusal to release our hostages, as well as its rejection of all the proposals it has received from US presidential envoy Steve Witkoff and from the mediators. And it goes on, Haaretz to say, but it must be said loudly and clearly that this is a lie. It was Israel, not Hamas, that violated the agreement. On its 16th day, the parties were supposed to begin discussing the second phase, which was supposed to end with the release of all the remaining hostages. Israel refused. Now, this is such an important point to make. The point being, of course, the truth, the facts. Throughout Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people, Western media coverage has been overwhelmingly dire, and that's putting it kindly. And so it remains in the case of what's happened with this so-called ceasefire. Media outlets in the West fail to inform the Western public about how Israel has systematically and grievously violated the so-called ceasefire when it was in place. That involved killing around 150 Palestinians when the so-called ceasefire was in place, to violating promises on humanitarian aid, which culminated in a total siege on anything and everything entering Gaza from the beginning of this month. These Western media outlets then failed to inform the Western public that it was Israel which objectively destroyed the ceasefire. Instead, they centred Israel's deceitful claims and treated them as though they were credible. This is a classic example of that quote. If someone says it's raining and another person says it's dry, it's not your job to quote them both. Your job is to look out the fucking window and find out which is true. So to continue with Haaretz. Israel also broke its promise to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor between the 42nd and 50th day of the ceasefire. Moreover, Israel announced that it was halting the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza and closing the border crossings. That decision, like the energy minister's decision to halt the limited amount of electricity Israel provides to Gaza, explicitly violates Israel's commitment in the agreement that aid will continue entering as long as talks on the second stage are ongoing. It goes on to say, all the proposals that Hamas received from Witkoff stem from Israel's refusal to uphold its part of the deal. Consequently, the attempt to portray Hamas's rejection of Witkoff's proposals as a reason to resume the fighting is nothing but a dishonest manipulation. Now again, let's just be clear here. A state committing every war crime and crime against humanity under the sun is going to lie. A lie all the time, lie relentlessly. Indeed, it's an objective fact that the Israeli state lies and lies and lies and lies and lies, provably so, not least about the atrocity which it commits. But Western media outlets continue to treat Israel as a quote-unquote democratic state whose public statement should be treated as credible. They defer to what Israel says as though we can take that seriously. That is not an honour extended to, for example, the Russian authorities, and rightly so. In doing so, Western media outlets make themselves not just complicit in Israeli lies, they become part of Israel's propaganda machine. We have to rely, in this case, on an Israeli newspaper, which I might add operates under military censorship, to spell out basic facts, which almost no Western media outlet will do. This is ridiculous. Now, as Haaretz says, Israel, not Hamas, is the one preventing the deal's implementation and the hostages' return. Now, here's another source I'm going to bring up. Now, to say I've had a falling out with my local Labour MP, Emily Thornberry, is quite the understatement. She's someone I used to get on with well, someone I respected despite our disagreements, and then she went and spoiled it all by saying something stupid like legitimising war crimes on national television. At the beginning of the genocide, in an effort to ingratiate herself with Keir Starmer, the Labour leader who publicly declared Israel had a right to cut off the essentials of life to the people of Gaza, Emily Thornberry refused to condemn such a legal siege as a violation of international law. Instead, responding to repeated questionings from the interviewer at the time about whether this constituted a violation of law by stating that Israel had an absolute right to defend itself. Well, this grubby little episode didn't actually work out very well for her, because after Starmer became Prime Minister, she was booted off the front bench. Now, last week, she finally expressed her outrage at Israel, not because of their hideous war crimes, but because one of their unhinged ministers had allegedly secretly filmed her and fellow British MPs. So what really angered her about Israel wasn't, all those murdered children, but being personally slighted. Anyway, useful context and disclaimers aside, let's listen to what she had to say on Sky News.
Emily, firstly, what are your thoughts on the interview and what's happening in Gaza?
So I think that what the ambassador was failing to acknowledge is that the deal that was agreed was one that many people in the international community, including President Biden, felt was ready to go last summer. And first of all, there were grave doubts as to why it had taken so long for it to be implemented in January. It could have happened much earlier. Biden said that, and the rest of the community feel the same. And it happens in phases. And as you were trying to say, phase one is a kind of almost like the easy bit. You release hostages and we will release prisoners and there will be a ceasefire. And then we move to phase two. And phase two is Israeli withdrawal, but still more hostages and more prisoners being released. And, and also negotiations beginning for what will be the long-term future for Gaza. Now, what happened was that we got to the 1st of March and the Israelis unilaterally, as far as I can see, said, we're not going into phase two. We want to just stay on phase one. We want to just keep having more hostages and releasing prisoners. We're not prepared to talk about moving out of Gaza, nor are we prepared to talk about a future for Gaza. And the reason for that is because Netanyahu is clinging on to power by his fingernails. He has to pass a budget at the end of March, and he has to pass that budget in order to continue the government that he's in charge of. And if he isn't in charge of the government in Israel, he personally gets into a great deal of trouble. There are court cases swirling around him, there are inquiries and everything else. So what he wants to do is he wants to extend that period as long as he can, and so that he can keep in power. He then begins the bombing. I'm sorry to be quite as brutal as this, but I really can't see any other explanation for this. He begins the bombing. Ben-Gvir, who's pulled out of his government, comes back into the government again, so helping to shore up the government, helping to get his budget through. And in the meantime, 300 plus Palestinians are killed. And the war aims are not clear as to what it is that they're doing. Who is it that they're going after? They say they're still going after Hamas after all this time. But how is it, if they're going after Hamas in a way which is proportionate, that we get so many civilians that are killed? And that is the problem. And that is the problem the Israeli ambassador has when it comes to answering this.
Well, I think there's a lot in that. I do think it's important to centre the fact that Israel does have a clear, coherent plan, and that's to rid itself of the Palestinian people. At its core, the Israeli state wants the Palestinian people to no longer exist. There's a bare minimum not to live in Gaza or the West Bank and not to have a Palestinian identity. I mean, the very existence of a Palestinian identity they regard as an existential menace. Now, Israel works backwards from that position, and it considers at any given time what is politically, militarily, and diplomatically possible. Now, whilst Joe Biden directly facilitated and armed Israel's genocide, Donald Trump has clearly further expanded what Israel believes it can get away with. That's not to say Netanyahu's own political and personal considerations aren't part of the calculations, they clearly are. Now, finally, Barak Ravid, who was a former IDF intelligence officer, now journalist, says the ceasefire did not, in quotes, collapse. It was collapsed by the Israeli government. The Israeli government never intended to fully implement the ceasefire agreement signed 2 months ago. It violated one of its key provisions, reneged on it, and tried to force an alternative arrangement on Hamas. Look, I told you this all the time. I mean, I did say this when the ceasefire was signed. I said, it's clear Israel has briefed. They're just going to look for any opportunity to destroy it and continue the genocide. I said that over and over again. I did videos about it. Now, the point is, Israel is deliberately destroying the ceasefire, not Hamas, and committing grievous atrocities as it does. All of these sources are correct. That's just the fact. It's the facts of the matter. And the vast majority of the Western media are not treating this as an objective fact, and in doing so, they're not doing their job. They're doing the opposite. They are deceiving their readers and their viewers. Well, as Israel unleashes hell, the human cost this week has been hideous. In southern Gaza, one hospital alone, the European hospital, has taken in 65 people killed since yesterday. Now, bear in mind, the remaining hospitals have been severely damaged, many of their medics killed, maimed, detained, disappeared by the Israeli army. These hospitals are deprived of medicine, technology, energy, you name it. It's estimated that around 600 Palestinians, as I read these words, have been killed since Israel resumed its outright violence this week, at least 200 of them children. Dr. Marwan Al-Hamas, the director of field hospitals at the Ministry of Health, reports that the Israeli military is using new weapons in Gaza, which are causing severe brain injuries and a significant increase in amputations. Listen to this finally, from the Palestinian journalist Ahmed Shamayeh in Gaza.
We are being bombed and killed, and the hunger is killing us. Also, the cold is hitting our bodies, and the sleepy world is watching. No one cares about us in Gaza. Please care more and more, and don't stop talking about us in Gaza. Thank you.
Well, many of us do care, of course. We care so much, but we have to be louder. We have to be more effective. We have to challenge the complicity, not just of our own governments, but of the Western media in this genocide. The lies, the gaslighting, the whitewashing, the omissions, the deference to Israeli claims and narratives, the erasure of the Palestinian experience. We could go on, because all of that has proven fundamental to the ability of Israel to continue committing this genocide. What I've stated here is the truth. And the fact the truth is what gets you badged as an extremist, gets you treated as controversial. You know, stating the truth is courageous in some way. That is indicative of the world turned on its head. And unless we turn the world back to its right position, or the position it should be in, then the world will burn, because we are seeing here the endless legitimacy of the most extreme depravity that humanity is capable of. And that depravity, if normalized, will consume us all. Please like and subscribe with your thoughts and your comments. Help us take on the pro-genocide mainstream media at patreon.com/ownjose84. I hope you can see how we've expanded and across different platforms. That's all possible thanks to you. And listen to us on the podcast as well. Get the video out. Liking and subscribing is good to encourage a wide audience. I'll speak to you soon.